The play on the field, the courts, and the ice is just one part of sports. Behind every game are the people hard at work so we can enjoy the action. They're the owners, administrators, agents, broadcasters, and promoters who bring the games to life. Meet them when you go behind the game with Patrick Klinger and Bill Robertson. Welcome to Behind the Game. I'm Patrick Klinger, back at the desk, wrestling out of Eagan, Minnesota. He's the commissioner of the Western Collegiate Hockey Association, Bill the Brawlin' Bear Robertson.
Wow. Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Is your signature move still the Mancini meat grinder?
Yes, it is. How did you know?
Oh, you're a legend.
That's great. Well, thank you, Patrick. Our special guest today is a good friend who's had a storied career in the crazy world of professional wrestling. But prior to that, he had played football at the University of Minnesota, also ran track and field. If you remember his name, he was part of both the AWA and the WWF, and known as the High Flyers. He and Greg Gagne were mates and one of the most spectacular wrestling tag teams in the history of the sport. With us today is Jumpin' Jim Brunzell. And Jim, it's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Bill and Patrick.
I was so looking forward to this when we were able to connect and to have you come on. And I told Patrick that there's so many questions. We could be here for several hours asking you all about the world of professional wrestling in your career. But before we even dive into that, and this will go quickly, as I said, tell us what you're doing now since your career is over. I'd love to hear about that.
Well, I think I was around 50 years old when I had my last match. And matter of fact, it was on my birthday in 1999. And shortly thereafter, I realized I couldn't do it anymore. And, I was 50 years old, so I actually was looking for an opportunity to sell supplements because I'd been taking supplements all my life. And had an opportunity I went out to Park City, Utah, and I interviewed for about 6 hours with this one company, and I thought, I'm going to get this job. Well, when I flew back home, they called me the next day, and they said, Jim, you were a finalist, but we hired a fellow that was quite a bit younger than you and had more experience. So I was really down, and a friend of mine had told me that there was an opportunity for a janitorial supply salesman in New Brighton. So, like I mentioned before, I called them up and I got an interview, and the general manager was an ex-collegiate wrestler at the University of Wyoming. His name was Rod Dummer. So he and this other fellow interviewed me, and at the end of the interview, this this salesman who had been at Delco for many years, his name was Bob Stanford, big rotund guy, and he looked at me and he says, Jimmy, he says, how did it feel to go and wrestle in your underwear every night? And I looked at him, and Rod Dummer says, you're hired. So that was my start there. But so I've been there 20 years. I've been on probation every year, but I'm very thankful to Delco for keeping me in. And people always ask what do old wrestlers do, and I say, well, I got a hell of a deal on 2-ply toilet paper right now.
And Jim, before you entered the ring, you had a standout career as a wide receiver and a tight end at the University of Minnesota, playing for Murray Warmath. What do you remember about those days? And did you have any aspirations to play in the NFL?
Oh, I did. I a lot of people, when I left White Bear Lake High School, I had a good football career there, and I had a couple small offers, from small schools, but I wanted to be a Gopher, so I walked on, and I had a really different relationship with Murray Warmath. It was mostly a love-hate relationship, and that shifted. I could tell a couple stories about Murray and I, but I remember Bob Stein, who was the All-American and defensive end, and also he kicked off. So my sophomore year, I wasn't on scholarship. My sophomore year, I was a second-string kicker, too. So Bob Stein had a bad knee. We're playing Leroy Keys and the number 4 ranked Purdue team. on TV. It was a national game of the week. So before the game starts, Murray Warmath says, Brunzell, he says, you're kicking off and kicking extra points and field goals. And, right away I'm nervous as heck. So wind up starting the game. I kicked off, got it down to 2 or 3 yard line. We tackled. On the second or third play, they fumbled. And on the second play, Minnesota had the ball. Jim Carter, the fullback, ran 40 yards, and he ran over 4 or 5 guys into the end zone. So I grabbed the kicking tee, that point after tee, and I'm running onto the field. All of a sudden, it was like the hand of God stopped me. And here Murray Warmath had chased me onto the field, and he had grabbed my triceps with his hand so hard, and he jerked me around and looked at me face to face. He says, you don't kick extra points. Nygren, get in here. So I'm shuddering. I'm like this on the sideline, and tears are coming down my. And I'm 19 years old, so they had a television timeout, and the referee gives me the ball to kick off again, and the ball goes right through my hands. And he says to me, "Are you okay, son?" I said, "Yeah." But so that was one story with Murray. So it was pretty. That went on for 3 years. He, matter of fact, he told me. Well, I'll tell you a real quick other story. We used to stay at the St. Paul Hotel before our game. So it was Halloween week, and Joe Rosenfield, our team manager, had brought this Frankenstein monster mask, and I thought, I'll put this on, and all the black players would get together in the room, and they'd sing, they'd harmonize. And so I had covers from my bed, and I had this Frankenstein mask, and I ran into the room, scared the crap out of them, and all of a sudden, I went back, and all of a sudden I hear a knock on the door, and I says, "Who is it?" And he says, "Coach Warmath." So I opened up the door, and he had a smile on his face, and he said, "Brunzy," he says, "I heard you were entertaining our players from down south." He says, "Do you mind telling me what you were doing?" So I grabbed this mask, and I said, "Coach," I said, "I was just doing this, just for lightheartedness." And he looked at me, and his smile went to a frown, and he grabbed me by the throat, put me up on the wall, and he said, "Brunzell," he says, "if you by any chance get to play tomorrow," he says, "I hope they knock the piss out of you." And he threw me against the wall. So this was about 11 o'clock at night, and Kevin Ham, my roommate, who was another split, he was smoking a cigarette and drinking a Coke, and he had to put him out, when Murray came in, and he said, "Brunzy," he says, "God, he's going to get me too, But I told him, I said, "I'm going to call my folks and have them come and pick me up. I can't play for this guy anymore." But that was just another little sequence, and it went on that way for a couple of years. So, yeah, he and I, although I learned an awful lot from him, as all of our players did. He was just leaps and bounds ahead of everybody in terms of field position and ball control and dominating the line of scrimmage. And it holds true today. You watch all these games, teams that dominate both the offense and defensive line, they usually win.
It's true. How did you end up going from the gridiron? I mean, you had a tryout, you said, with the Washington Redskins that lasted, what they call as a cup of coffee, so to speak.
Exactly.
But still a great experience. How did you go from doing that, jumping into the wrestling ring?
Well, Billy, I tell you what happened. Greg Gagne was my freshman quarterback. He was a walk-on too from Mound, and of course his dad was the legendary pro wrestler Vern Gagne. And after 2 years into the university, Greg had realized he wasn't going to play quarterback, so he transferred to Wyoming, where he did play a little quarterback. So I got done with the university, had this little tryout, came home, knew I wasn't going to get called back by the Redskins, and so I thought, I'm going to get my degree. I had like 31 credits left to get my degree, and then Greg called me and he says, "Hey, we just came back from the Olympics. My dad's going to have a camp," and Ken Patera, Khosrow Vaziri, who was an Iranian Greco-Roman wrestler, Ric Flair, Bob Bruggers, who was also a great athlete at the University of Minnesota, myself, and Greg Gagne were going to be part of this. And I thought, well, I want to do something athletic. And it was, I've mentioned this before, if somebody would have, asked me at 18 years old if I was going to have a 25-year career wrestling professionally, I would have said, you're crazy. But it happened.
How different is professional wrestling today from when you were in the ring?
Oh, it's night and day. See, Patrick, when I was wrestling, there was 26 different territories you could wrestle at all over the country. Now there's only one, really, and that's Vince McMahon, WWE. What has happened, Vince has showcased his style of what he wants people to realize what is pro wrestling. And if you watch the WWE, and I don't watch it very much at all, what you see is almost everybody's the exact same. I mean, they all come out, they interview, they're all braggadocious. There's no weakness. There's nobody that, you know, backs up, you know, and consequently, everything's, you know, I mean, from all their interviews, they're all choreographed. Their interviews, I saw Hulk Hogan about 5 or 6 years ago. I went to the Target Center to introduce my little grandsons to him, and he had a 12-page set that he had to memorize, and he was going to be Santa that week in the ring. So everything is, you know, completely choreographed. Every move in the ring, and consequently, there's no spontaneity. There's no telling of a story, and to me, it's lost, you know, its definition. And what used to be when we were, it was the fight between good and evil. That was it. Simple.
Minnesota State has a wonderful history of pro wrestling, not only with the AWA, but just the individuals. You talked about Vern Gagne, Greg Gagne, Ric Flair is from here, Kurt Hennig,
Yes, and rest his soul.
And Brock Lesnar, and yourself. What do you think makes Minnesota so unique to professional wrestling? Because it is. A lot of people think it's the capital of pro wrestling as it started.
Well, there's a group of fellows that, you know, that I started with, and you can look back in the 70s, in the middle 70s, and you can look at the talent that was in the AWA, and it was the greatest talent in pro wrestling, period. Anybody in the AWA could go anywhere in the country and be a top performer, and they did. I mean, if you look back on all, and look at Ric Flair, you know, he's 71, he wants to get in the ring with Hulk Hogan, you know, who's 68, and, you know, they're trying, you know, for another $1 million payoff, more power to them if they can get it, but without a doubt, Minnesota, just for some reason or other, and I have to believe it was that foundation that Vern had established, you know, back in the 70s, because he wouldn't let anybody, you know, come in. And if somebody thought they were real smart and they thought, you know, between him and Billy Robinson, they'd grind him up. You know, I mean, they'd be crying, you know, and hooked and submitting and tapping out and say, oh, geez, you know, and then they wouldn't show up again, maybe.
Yeah. Some of those cards at the Minneapolis Auditorium, the St. Paul Auditorium, the St. Paul Civic Center, I think some of them on holidays, right? Thanksgiving was
huge.
Was that a huge?
Yep, that was huge, Patrick.
What do you remember about some of those cards?
Well, I remember Greg and I were in, I think this was in the middle 80s. We were in a cage match with Jesse Ventura and Adrian Adonis. And it drew the biggest house that was ever in the St. Paul Civic Center. They had 19,000 people there. And I remembered the payoff I got. It was the biggest payoff, and I can remember it was $4,578. And that was the biggest payoff I ever got, you know, in my career. And it was unbelievable, and we got very little mention in the St. Paul paper or nothing. But it was just crazy, you know, 19,000 people. I mean, you looked and you think you were at a Springsteen concert.
You know, there are some great characters outside the ring. You think about Marty O'Neill, the late Marty O'Neill.
Yeah.
And I knew his mother real well. She worked at the Highland Bank as a kid, and I used to go up there because I thought that was royalty, because she was married to Marty O'Neill. And then you had Mean Gene Okerlund, and then you have Wally Carbo as just a few, and there's many more. But tell us what your recollections of those characters were.
Well, Marty O'Neill was one of the greats, you know, and he established the interview, you know, in the 60s. and into the 70s. And then Gene Okerlund, who to me was the greatest of all. I mean, Gene, God rest his soul, could do an interview, and he could sense how it was going, and he helped whoever he was interviewing, you know, with just putting different thoughts in the guy's head. And he was incredible. You know, and then Wally Carbo, honest to God, Wally Carbo, who was known as sort of a shady guy, and I'll tell you this real quick story. And Wally was a Catholic, not a practicing Catholic, but he was a Catholic. So he had a big smile on his face at the office one day, and I says, Wally, I said, what are you so happy about? He said, Jim, he says, I went to communal penance today, and he said, all my sins are wiped away. And he says, all I had to do was tell him one sin. So, and Wally had been known to be, you know, shady and a womanizer, and you know, had moved some hot stuff before. So I said to him, Wally, I says, tell me the sin you confessed. He says, I told him I missed Mass on Sunday. And that was his grievous sin that he said.
Andre the Giant, Vern Gagne, Nick Bockwinkel, The Crusher, Mad Dog Vachon, Hulk Hogan, Jesse the Body Ventura, some of the biggest names in wrestling. Not only the biggest names in wrestling, but really the biggest names in sports for a while. Really unique characters. Tell us about some of the most unique individuals that you met while you were wrestling.
Well, without a doubt, Mad Dog Vachon was one of the, I don't want to say weird, but he was capable of anything and at any time of the day. You know, like all of a sudden, if he and I were sitting together, all of a sudden he'd jump up and he'd look at me and he says, you know, there's nothing worse than a human bite. And then he'd sit back down, you know, and he'd say that. And I'll never forget the time I had a match with him in Omaha. It was in Denver. I was scared to death because he looked at me like this across the ring, and I thought, oh God, here we go. And I was a young guy, so we tied up, and you know, he wanted to be real stiff in the ring, so he got me into the ropes, and he hit me, and I reversed him, and I hit him back, and he said, harder. So I hit him back harder, and he says, harder. So I wound up, and when I hit him right on the chin, and he went down to the second turnbuckle and popped up, shook his head, poked me in the eyes, and then fish hooked my mouth like this, and ran me across the ring and threw me onto the concrete floor. So I'm laying on the concrete floor. All of a sudden, I see a vision, you know, like black and white, and all of a sudden, all the air is out of my stomach. He had jumped with both of his feet from the apron onto my chest. So he's throwing me back in the ring, and he says, not that hard. So he was character, you know. He was something.
How about, I think people would want to know, you know, the Crusher was big because he was from Milwaukee, and people loved him. And at the end of the day, they loved Mad Dog Vachon, and you wrestled with Greg Gagne, and then later with B. Brian Blair. But we were talking off air about Andre the Giant, who's transcended the sport because of his size and his loving nature, I guess, in some ways. But what is your recollection? You wrestled with him and against him,
Yep.
Am I correct?
Yes, but mostly with him in forms of the Battle Royal. As a matter of fact, he and I were the last in the ring a couple times. And you know, Andre was a great guy, and I brought him over to my house one time after TV, and he was standing on the ground, and my wife opened up the door on the porch, and he was still taller than her. And my daughter, who was only about 2 years old, saw him and ran away and went into her room and was scared to death of him. And he says, your daughter's scared of me, Jim. I said, that's okay. But Andre was, you know, it was hard being a giant. You know, in every place he went, we used to have these Halliburton bags. They were metal bags, and all the wrestlers used to have their gear in there and their tights and everything. And Andre used to have a bumper sticker on his bag, and it said, don't get too close or I'll fart. And he'd hold it up in front of him as he walked off the plane. But he was just a wonderful guy to me, and I had a couple, I'll tell you a quick story. He was so good to me. We're up in Winnipeg, and there's a place called, it was a French little boutique that you could go in and have a real nice lunch. So I thought, Jesus, it was called Chez Andre. As a matter of fact, that's what it was called too. So I said, Andre, I want to bring you in here for lunch. I said, it's French cuisine. He said, okay. So we go in, and I saw that special was like $6.99 for a pork cutlet with salad and stuff. So we sit down, and he orders a double shot of Remy Martin, and then he has a bottle of wine. So, and I have a Coke with this pork cutlet. So I'm thinking, you got $12 and whatever this and mine. And the bill was $120. You got a $100 bottle of wine, and the Remy Martin was 20-some bucks. So after we ate, I says, Andre, next time, you pay for the booze and I'll pay for the food. And he says, all right.
Most of your career was spent as a tag team partner.
Right.
What was it about being, having a tag team that really allowed you to sort of fill that niche? Why do you think that you were really successful as a tag team as opposed to maybe an individual wrestler?
Oh, gosh. I think, when you have a niche like that and it proves to be profitable and successful, you sort of stay in that. I had been a partner with Greg off and on for 10 years, and I left for 2 years to go down to Charlotte and wrestle in the Mid-Atlantic in the NWA because I wanted to see what I could do by myself. And I realized I sort of got pigeonholed as Greg's partner, and the high flyers were only going to go as high as the high flyers, And I thought, I could wrestle with anybody. And that's why I went to North Carolina, and after 2 years, I thought, I'm going to go back to the AWA and just, if they put us together, And I remember the promoter, a fellow by the name of Jim Barnett, legendary guy in Atlanta. He invited me up to his place one time, and he says, I'll tell you now, Jimmy, he says, if you go back to Minnesota, back to Vern Gagne, it'll be the worst move that you will make in your professional wrestling career. So I went back, and it was the biggest year I ever made. I made $85,000, which was incredible. And Greg and I renewed the high flyer deal, and we had an ongoing feud with Jesse and Adrian, and things were great. So it was completely opposite, from what I was going to see down in Atlanta.
Now, the heels and the good guys,
Right.
so to speak, is it true that you could never be seen, the heels and the good guys together, or is that not true? When you were out in public at a restaurant,
Yeah.
you were out just anywhere in town?
Well, we had talked this before the airing of this, Billy, that when we go to Mancini's on a Sunday night after the matches, the bad guys or the heels would sit in one corner of the restaurant, and then the baby faces or good guys would sit far away. So anybody who was there wouldn't see us, And basically, there was sort of a feeling and deal where you just didn't, communicate with the bad guys because, you guys were yelling at each other and beating the daylights out of each other, and it wouldn't look very good, And Vern, he would have had a fit. He would have probably, knocked you out. So that
Okay.
didn't happen,
Because that's always been something I wanted to ask a pro wrestler. Why would that be? And I understand it because it's part of the theatrics of making sure that the good guys are on one side and the
Right.
bad guys are on the other.
Was there ever a time when things didn't go as planned in the ring? You pretty much know how things are supposed to
Right.
go. But I suspect when you're wrestling just about every single day that once in a while things don't quite go as planned.
Well, not too. It was very seldom that you'd have a flare up or something like that, and it did happen. I mean, there was some guys that were pretty hot headed, and there were some guys that were under the influence when they were in the ring, and if they had conjured in their own mind that something wasn't going the way they wanted, and then they got real bullish, and you just sort of dealt with that the best way you could, and then hopefully the match survived, and 99.9% of the time it did, But there was some real care. I could say, there was probably two guys that out of all the guys I wrestled through 25 years, I thought were a little hard to work with in the ring.
Tell us a little bit about your book, Matlands.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, I wrote this book, and it was 5 years in the making. And I had been to a couple parties and talked about different stories, and one of our friends said, Jim, you should write a book about your stories. So I put together about 47 stories over the period of 5 years, and had written down both with a little dictaphone and also writing. And then I started to write these. And I had a wonderful library of photographs. And these photographs are all my own in there. And my wife typed it all together, and then we had it edited about 3 or 4 times. And I remember trying to publish it. A publishing company said, yeah, well, it'll be 25 grand, and then we'll, you know, publish it for you, and then you'll get X amount per book. And so we found this little company called Blurb online, and you submit the manuscript to them. They put everything together, and then they charge you a fee, and then you can sell the book online, and that's what we did. Or I can buy the book and then take them to my autograph signings and sign them. So, you know, it's been really successful, and you know, I always write on there, enjoy these true stories, because there was no ghostwriter. You know, I wrote every single word on there.
Well, I was honored to receive a copy in the mail, autograph copy, and I thought it was fascinating. Tell us the online email address if people
Well,
want
it's
that.
Blurb, BLURB,
Okay.
.com, and you can go on there and you can punch up Matlands, and then it'll have a smiley face of me. And then this picture here, I don't know if they can, well, you can see it. It shows me as a 5-year-old, and I'm sitting on a little chair, and I'm on the atoll of Kwajalein Atoll out in the Marshall Islands. Back in 1955, my dad was a naval pilot, and we were out there for like 9 months. And Kwajalein was only 1.5 miles long and 0.5 mile wide. It was all coral, and there was no school. So all it was a military base, and they'd pick up all the kids on a Saturday, bring us to the base, and we'd see these comic strips that they'd show us, you know, and what news happened in the week. So
Interesting.
it was an interesting experience. I traveled a lot when I was a young kid, because my dad was a pilot, and we were all over, and it was funny. My career, I traveled a lot as a wrestler.
Jim, we're down to the last 30 seconds.
Okay.
Tell us about your health. How are you? You know, when you're wrestling just about every day,
Yep.
I assume that takes a toll on your body.
Well, I've had like 8 or 10 surgeries because of my wrestling career. I had both knees replaced. One knee I've had revisions twice with. I've had 2 surgeries on my shoulder and 1 replacement, and my hip. And I had 2 athletic hernias. So I had a little bout of melanoma, which was from sun tanning. But I feel very fortunate, you know, to still be in capacity of the marbles I have left in my head. My wife questions it a little bit at the time, but I've had a real blessed career in life, and I'm very thankful.
Terrific. And we're very thankful that you
Thank you
joined
for
us
being
today.
here.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Bill. And thank you for watching Behind the Game.